So you've heard of the law of unexpected consequences. The law is designed that, or what the law really means is that sometimes people with good intentions occasionally create unexpected outcomes. And I think of this law every time I think about some of the early certification programs that Microsoft had and the first round of the MCSE days. You know, when Microsoft first introduced the MCSE, it was at the time period when they were first doing things like Active Directory, and so a lot of the test questions had to do with Active Directory and all the things you needed to do in order to get it built and put into your environment. And as a consequence of that, I think a lot of what could have been really simple Active Directory structures, you know, I was talking about single forest, single domain back on that last nugget, ended up being really complex or perhaps unnecessarily complex, in part because people just learned about how to build domains and then implemented it. And it took us a while, I think over a decade, to get all these really complex structures rolled back together again into what is now a much better operating environment. If you've ever had to work in a multi-domain environment or a multi-forest environment, you're aware of just the sheer pain that it can be to find out where the objects are and get the right objects, the right permissions, and the right domains and make sure that everything maps correctly. You know, these days I am so glad that we have gotten to the point in many environments where this is the case. And I'm also glad that Microsoft in this test has kind of defocused a lot of that original kind of core academic style stuff you have to know towards rational, real world things that you're going to need to implement. Well, back on that last nugget, we talked about how, when we were creating multiple domain or multiple forest environments, when we create these multiple domains, the way in which these domains are connected together is via this mechanism called trusts. And that in a multiple domain, so single forest, multiple domain environment, the trusts are created for you automatically. So again, if I've got company.com down here and I create developers.company.com and production.company.com, as soon as I create those domain controllers and as soon as I associate them with the root domain up here, well, the trusts are automatically laid into place. And this can continue down as far as we need to all the way down the tree. This is somewhat different when we incorporate the connection of multiple forests together. I mean, if you think about it, Company and Bob's Biscuit Factory had nothing to do with each other until the day that two executives sat down on the golf course and decided that they want to merge their two companies together. So, whereas in the multiple domain single forest world, you're not going to spend much time doing too much trusting. There is one specific use case where you will. That's called a shortcut trust. You're not going to see much of the use of these things out in the wild. You may occasionally see it in the cases of mergers and acquisitions, or if you need to spin off pieces of your company. That's where you tend to see most of these types of things actually happen in your actual personal experience. Now, in this nugget, we're going to talk about four things. Okay, we're going to talk about the different kinds of trusts and really the rules of trusts. I've got a whole long list of things that you just got to know for the test because they are the long-standing rules of what trusts are, how to think about them, and what they mean. Then we'll talk about three little pieces of the implementation of trusts that you got to be aware of because there are just some options that you need to think about when you go about creating a trust. One of which is the type of authentication, so forest-wide or selective, whenever I'm creating forest trusts. One is how I want to enable or disable the routing of particular name suffixes. Remember we were talking about those UPD suffixes back on that last nugget. Excuse me, not UPD, UPN suffixes back on that last nugget. And how the UPN suffixes can be different ways that my users may log in. Well, here in a multi-forest or multi-domain world, I may not want some of those name suffixes to get routed around the structure. And I can disable them when I create them or when I create the trust. And then lastly is this thing that's by default always on that you should probably never, ever, ever disable, except in a very rare circumstances that I can't even really think of, but is something that you should know because it's a buried command that is part of NetDOM. So I will show you what it is, I will explain what it means, and then I'll tell you probably after you take the test, just ignore this for the rest of your time. So here in this nugget, we're going to spend a minute actually creating a trust. I've got two different forests put together here so we can take a look at what it looks like whenever you actually get to put two forests together. This should be something cool because, to be honest, the number of times that you get an opportunity to do trusts, this almost never happens in a person's career. So if you do get an opportunity to connect a couple of forests together, consider yourself lucky because that there are not a lot of IT pros that get an opportunity to really do this, and it's kind of cool, honestly, to be able to see these, this domain and this domain get trusted together, and then the objects just, authenticating backwards and forwards. It's neat to be able to be a part of that. If you should get that opportunity, you gotta respect the rules of trusts. And for the most part, these rules haven't evolved for generations. So I've got a long list of just stuff here, and I apologize for just the big black space that I've created here, but I want you to be aware of the following rules because these have been test questions since the beginning, and they may be test questions again. So when I create a trust, let me remove my little thing here. Okay, so when I create a trust, let's go back here to my example before. Let's say I have two different companies. So company dot PRI, and I talked about the biscuit factory before, but I'm actually going to trust this to my own personal network here, which is a specialized dot net. Okay, this is my own domain. So here in our demo, we're going to create a trust. Now, when you do create a trust, there is a thing you have to think of, what we think of as the directionality of the trust, or which way does the arrow point. So when I'm trusting something, is company.pri trusting specialized.net, or is specialized.net trusting company.pri? Now stop and think about that for a second, right? Because if I'm, for example, buying specialized.net, I may not necessarily want the people over here in specialized.net to yet access the resources in company.pri. They're just brand new, recently acquired company. Or I may want them to. So when I create this trust, I have to determine which direction I want the trust to go. And that can either go in one direction, it can go in the other direction, or it can go in both directions through what's called a bidirectional trust. So this is extremely important for you to recognize because the wording that's used here to determine this directionality is important. The trusting domain, is the domain that contains the resources that you want to allow access. Okay, I have a bunch of resources. I'm going to allow access to these resources, and so this is the trusting domain. The trusted domain, okay, ing and ed here, the trusted domain contains the security principles, or let's just make it simple here, the users computers, the thing that you apply a privilege to. It contains the users to which you're going to grant access to the resources. And the magic thing that I have been using for forever to help me remember which direction the order goes is ing to ed. The trusting domain points at the trusted domain. The other thing to remember is that the direction of trust is opposite the direction of access. So when I'm doing my little ing-ed example here, the trust is going in this direction and the access is going in the other direction. Yes, if this sounds really complex, don't sweat it because this has been ridiculously complex since the very beginning. It is test question material, and again, in the real world, you may never ever have the opportunity to do this. So you got to know it for now, and then if you get the opportunity to, go look it up because it will become important for a very short period of time. Now, what happens most often in the world is not this one-way anymore these days. It is not so much these one-way trusts. What happens most in the world these days are what we think of as two-way or bi-directional trusts. And I say that because in the modern 2014 world, there are other technologies that layer on top of Active Directory that are probably better and easier and simpler at managing authentication. Okay, so we use other stuff to do that now. Back in the days when Active Directory first was around, we didn't have those kinds of technologies, so we had to think more about its use. Most in the real world of your domain trusts are going to be two-way, and I'm going to show you a two-way trust here when we take company.pri and trust it up with specialized.net. Trusts, when you create them, can be transitive, meaning just like the transitive property. If A, then B, if B, then C, if A, then B, and if B, then C, well, then definitely A, then C. So that's the mathematical transitive property. And depending on the type of trust that you create and the settings that are associated with that type, you can optionally choose whether that type is going to be transitive or not. I'll talk about selective authentication as another mechanism here in just a second. So those are the rules, okay? Ing to id, and the direction of trust is opposite to the direction of access. That's what you got to know. All right, now the second half of these rules are the types of trusts that are going to be available to you. Another awesome test question here because this is just kind of academic, silly stuff. Right there. So there are really four kind of categories of trusts that you have the potential for creating. The first of which is what we call an external trust. Now let's assume that I have two different forests here. Here's forest A, and here's forest B. All right, and this guy's got two down here because he got really silly. Okay, so there's my two forests. In an external trust, one of the domains in one of the forests trusts one of the domains in a different forest, so over here. That trust gets established not at the forest level, not at the top level node, but from one of the domains to another of the domains. And it's a domain in a different forest. That's important to recognize when it comes to an external trust. Sometimes you see this not because an entire company wants to, trust their forests together, but because you create a subdomain that is going to be used to partner with somebody else's subdomain. It can happen. Now, this doesn't tend to happen really that often in the wild, again, because there are better technologies to accomplish this today. And the types of firewall ports that are required to get the traffic from one domain to the other to facilitate that trust is typically far beyond the willingness of most security guys these days. The security people look at the kind of traffic that's required and go, no. So you can do this, but you just don't see this happen that often in the wild. Okay, so be aware that you can do it. Be aware that you probably never will. Now, a shortcut trust does actually happen sometimes in environments where people have gotten so ridiculous with the numbers of domains that they've created a domain tree that has become exceptionally deep. Okay, so this is, company.com, and this is developers.company.com, and this is, the smart developers at company.com, and this is the really smart developers at company.com, or whatever. Well, when the really smart developers at company.com need to talk to the really ridiculous production people at company.com, in order for the people over here to be able to authenticate against resources all the way over in this tree, they've got to go hop, 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 hop. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different hops. That's a lot of hops, right? And the amount of time it can take just for your authentication request to get through all these hops and probably across geographic locations can be a bit of a nightmare. So a shortcut trust literally is designed to shortcut that process, to take this domain to this domain for no other reason than to accelerate the process or accelerate the authentication among resources in far-reaching branches of a tree. You don't ever have to do this if you have a small tree, but if you have a very large tree, sometimes these shortcut trusts can accelerate things. You're literally shortcutting from one step to the other. So those are the two that you probably are not going to see that much in the wild, but you do have to know them for the test. There is a third one here that is a realm trust that you see occasionally. You see it sometimes. And the only thing about a realm trust is that a realm trust is a trust to a non-Active Directory, I think it says non-Kerberos here. It should actually say a non-Active Directory Kerberos realm. That's actually correct right there. So a Linux-based Kerberos authentication database. Happens sometimes, also relatively rare. Now, the one where you do see it occasionally are these forest trusts, and this is literally a trust between two entire forests. So back up here with the forest number one on this side and forest number two on this side, a forest trust happens when the top node, the root node of both of these forests, ends up trusting each other. And the neat part about this is that when I create a forest trust, I'm essentially linking all the domains of all the forests. Also, a forest trust is always a transitive trust. The point here is literally to connect these two organizations together from an authentication standpoint. Now, even though it is always transitive, there may be some situations where you don't want that transitivity to be complete throughout the entire new, much larger structure. So maybe you want to be able to choose where people can authenticate even though there is this full transitivity. It is for this reason that we have the ability to configure the authentication type to be either forest-wide or selective. The only difference here is that does everybody have the ability to authenticate to everything else, or do I get to choose? Very, very, very important point here is the fact that when we talk about configurable authentication, we are talking about authentication and not authorization. So if I were to set this to forest-wide, this does not immediately mean that every single human being is going to access every single resource across the different forests. So don't worry, that's not what we're talking about here. We're just talking about the authentication of resources from one domain over to another domain inside that forest. So these are the rules of trusts. And again, don't worry if you're not getting this, because I will tell you that indeed the rules of trusts are complex, and Microsoft prides itself on making them that way, I think just to make the test questions that much harder sometimes. I don't know. Let me show you how the whole trusting thing looks. And again, this is kind of the cool part because you may never get to do this in the real world. You might set it up so you can follow along, but the opportunity to get this, to do this in the real world just doesn't happen all that often. Well, let's go up here to Active Directory Domains and Trusts. We are going to, again, create a trust between this company, or excuse me, this domain here, this forest, company.pri, and we're also going to associate it with another forest called 199. My other forest, which is specialized.net. So let me log in there so I can, yes, so I can show you that over on the specialized.net domain controller. Here's bighit.specialized.net. I like to name the servers in this after brands of bicycles from the company Specialized, just like the mountain bike. So they're all Big Hit and Epic and Stump Jumper and Rockhopper and all those. So I'm old school. I like to name my servers after fun things. So here on company.pri, okay, switch back. Here on company.pri, we want to instantiate this trust. We want to create this trust between the two companies. In order for us to be able to do this, we have to be able to resolve the other domain. Now it's here where people can get tripped up quite a bit because the name resolution between domains is something that is not commonly already set up in DNS, right? Our DNS is probably Active Directory integrated. It's probably focused on the domain. I'm guessing that the people at Bob's Biscuit Factory do not have secondaries yet on my for my company DNS zones. Well, when that's the case, in order for us to be able to set up this trust, we first have to set up either DNS secondaries, and I'm just literally creating a secondary lookup zone that points to specialized.net. Now, doing all that can require some coordination between the two DNS, the people responsible for DNS in different organizations. So there is actually a way to cheat the process. And the way in which we cheat that process is by creating what's called a conditional forwarder. A conditional forwarder is different from a secondary zone because it is literally just a redirect. Hey, if you're looking for specialized.net, you're not looking for me, actually. You're looking for the other DNS server at 192.168.1.99. That's where you'll go to ask your question. So if I punch this in, don't worry about these errors because these errors always show up. I can create a conditional forward here, even store it in Active Directory if I want, that says, all right, if you're looking for specialized.net, well, the way in which you find it is by going to some other DNS server, which is 1.99. I should accomplish this over on the other server as well. So here in Big Hits DNS zone, I want to create a conditional forwarder over here for company.pri and set that to 192.168.168.1 dot, what is his IP address? 192.168.1 dot 200. Okay, so delete, delete, and 192.168.1.200. Okay, got to have, just like with routers, we have to have both sides of things working. So now I have a conditional forwarder on this domain, which is, oh, that's funny, I already have a secondary set up here. So conditional forwarders work, secondaries work as well. You can choose whichever you like, but I gotta have them so that I can least resolve from one side to the other. Doesn't matter how you do it. Once you've accomplished that, then the process to create the trust is relatively simple. Let me go here, and then back to Active Directory Domains and Trusts. Let us create a trust now here by setting a new trust. Remember when I told you you go from ing to ed, trusting to trusted? Here's trusting, trusted, right? Trusting, trusted, I think is how that goes. Let's connect up here to specialized.net. There's the domain I'm looking for, and this is going to be a forest trust between two forests. It is going to be a two-way trust because I want to authenticate backwards and forwards across both forests. I love this screen. I'd say this is a new screen, but it's a new screen as of at least a couple of versions ago. But in this single screen, I can create both sides of the trust in one wizard. I don't have to go and hop back and forth between two servers anymore to create both sides of the trust. So let's create the trust for both domains, this and the specified domain. For specialized.net, we'll do, I think it goes in this format, specialized G shields and the password. And then for, I'm already authenticated here in company.pri because obviously I've logged in. And then how do I want to set my authentication? Everybody authenticates to everybody, or do I want to selectively identify access for each domain and server? I will tell you, this adds a whole host of additional complexity to the process. This will drive you mad in using selective authentication. And not only do I have to determine authorization like NTFS berms, I also have to determine authentication options as well. So we will keep things easy with our forest-wide authentication here on both sides. So notice how this is like this local forest and specified forest, and then we're good. So that, hopefully, creates the trust between these two forests. Or it doesn't. Error here. No logon servers available to service a logon request. Okay, well, let's see. What's wrong here? Got a couple of these forest problems here. We'll remove them so we can just see why this isn't working. And we'll remove the trusts out there if I can. Let's see here, specialized.net. Oh, we're going to remove. I want to show you actually a couple of interesting little tricks you can use whenever you have problems like this, because figuring out why these error messages happen is sometimes a little bit challenging. So I'm going to bring up an elevated command prompt here just to give you a couple of tools that you can put in your quiver for helping you figure out when you have problems with these sorts of things. I told you that these trusts are all kind of sitting down upon the name resolution that we get out of DNS. And so we have to make sure first and foremost that we actually have DNS functioning. Let's just see. NS lookup company.pri. So I'm looking up actually the domain name here. Yep, that works. NS lookup specialized.net. And that works. So we definitely have name resolution on this side. Probably should repeat the process over here on this side as well. If I open up another command prompt and run as administrator. So let's test it over here. NS lookup company.pri, and that works. And NS lookup specialized.net. So we definitely have name resolution between these two domains, but why are we still getting this error message? It could be a timing issue, just something going on between the creation of all the DNS records that are associated with this domain, One other test that is kind of a cool one you should be aware of is one called NL test. And we'll talk more about NL test when we get into the sysvol chapter, but NL test ds get GDC is a mechanism that will let me check to see if a domain controller is actually responding or not. Let's see, specialized.net. Yep, actually we have a good response from bighit.specialized. This is from the machine DENDC1. Let's check it over here too. So now I'm on bighit. So let's do NL test ds get dc company.pri. And if I do everything, get, of course, not get dc company.pri. Yep, we have a successful response over on this side too. Maybe that was just an error message. Let's give the wizard another try over here. So let's create a trust, new trust here to specialized.net. I'll click next here. It's a forest trust, again, two-way for both servers. And we're going to punch in the specialized username and password that we'll use to authenticate the two trusts. And whoops, I already have a trust over here in the other domain. Goodness gracious, there are so many different ways in which you can really screw this up. You know, it's funny because sometimes with these presentations, putting these videos together, I kind of cut out all the mistakes so that you don't actually get a chance to see it. But these are nice because these trusts are so challenging to put together sometimes. And it's actually useful to be able to see sometimes the challenge that it takes just to get these silly trusts to function whenever you're connecting multiple domains together. It's also handy to recognize if you're having this much trouble just getting the trust up and operational, how much extra work it can be in trying to manage the resources between these two domains. So let's try this a third time, because third time is a charm. Forest trust here, two-way between the two domains, specialized G shields and the password. Choose next for forest-wide authentication on both sides, and ta-da! Okay, so third time indeed was a charm. So a trust has now been established. Now, when we create this trust, we have another step in the process, which is actually one of the things we need to accomplish here for this nugget, which is to configure the name suffix routing on the trust. It's here where we can identify for the authentication requests which of the name suffixes are going to get routed to the local forest. Okay, so there's multiple here, company.com, company.pri, because we set those UPN suffixes before. Do I want in the other half of the forest, in the other side of the forest, to route both of these name suffixes in company.com or just one of the name suffixes in company.com? So this gives me the ability to limit things again if I've made those changes back like I did just a little bit ago. Choose next here, complete the trust here. I do want to confirm the outgoing trust, confirm both of them, make sure we're all happy, and then we're good to go. Once we've set these up, you can go back here and then make other changes if you want. We'll talk a little later on about AES encryption, but if the other domain supports the additional stronger encryption on Kerberos, we can support that here. We can revalidate the trust. We can adjust which of the name suffixes are going to be enabled or disabled in this forest, or even adjust the authentication configuration we have here. You know, in reality, in the real world, whenever you get done with this, you pretty much set this thing up and then you don't really mess with it much anymore. One of the benefits that you do get after completing the trust is the ability to access objects from one domain into another domain. So let's say, for example, that I need to add in, for example, the administrators in one domain to the admins group in another domain. It is here where I can come into Active Directory users and computers and add in the members of other domains. So change the location here to specialized.net and then punch in the administrators group, or administrator, but administrators, domain admins, excuse me. The domain admins group from specialized.net to be a member of the administrators group of company.pri. And I've harped on it enough in this nugget, but the moving around of these objects from one domain to the other is where you're going to spend a nightmare of time, trying to figure out who belongs in what domain and for what reasons. But when you get done with configuring that trust and setting the authentication, your next step in the process is to actually enable the rights and privileges for users on things in the alternate domain. So I probably want to accomplish the same thing on the other side, so that domain admins on one side can be domain admins on the other side as well. Now, as you can imagine, whenever we do this process of setting these two domains together, it is entirely possible that users in a trusted forest could be able to actually elevate their privileges in a trusting domain if there's some sort of mismatch of the SIDs or similar security IDs between the users of the different domains. Here in Windows PowerShell, I can take a look at how to see security ID information. The get AD user command -filter star where select SAM account name SID gives me a look at the different SIDs and account names that are in this forest or in this domain. I can do the same thing over on the other domain as well. And in fact, it's all these bits right up here before the final dash that's equivalent to the domain SID. Now, in a case where I may inadvertently end up getting two domains that have similar SIDs, so two different accounts that have similar SIDs, that presents a situation where a user could end up elevating their privileges when we don't really want them to. Because it is a possibility, we're actually going to incorporate a thing called SID filtering. And the way in which it's turned on by default. This is something that's turned on by default, and you probably should never turn it off, and you can probably ignore it after this exam is complete. But the way that you can actually disable it is by running the netdom command with the switch. I'm looking this up here. Enable SID history. Yes, right there. You may also recognize SID history if you've done any other previous Active Directory migrations as one of the mechanisms that can be used also for maintaining these extra SIDs as objects are migrated from one domain to the other. That is totally not a topic for this test, but if you're ever doing a migration between domains, SID history becomes something very valuable to you because that's how you maintain the SIDs between domains. But most importantly, what have we talked about in this nugget? In this nugget, we have talked about trusts and all the interesting academia associated with trusts. There are four kind of major types here: external, forest, shortcut, and realm trusts. Many of these in the 2014 and forward days are the types of trusts that you're probably not going to implement, but you need to know what they are for the exam. We talked about how to limit trusts and set the authentication mechanism on that trust, forest-wide versus selective. We talked about that SID filtering and this very interesting SID history setting that you can enable on your domain. If you're interested in learning more about domain resource migrations, SID history is going to be your world for a period of time during that migration. And then we also talked about how to enable or disable name suffix routing if I've configured new user principal names, UPNs, in one of the forests associated with this trust. Coming up next, we will continue our exploration of Active Directory in these complex environments. And one cannot talk about Active Directory in complex environments unless one talks about the multiple site configurations of Active Directory. You might not ever get the opportunity to trust another organization, but it's fairly likely that at some point you may have an additional geographic site that makes up your company. And when that happens, all too often we forget that we need to adjust our Active Directory configuration because geographic sites and Active Directory sites tend to be aligned because of what is our need to control replication. Talking about sites is a topic for our next nugget. So until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.